Standing by the serene Blue Ridge Lake, a father demands his daughter pay the taxes on a house she doesn't own, while secretly hiding a $350,000 fortune for his golden boy. But he forgot one thing. His daughter tracks every penny, and the bill for his betrayal has just come due. Welcome back to Rose Revenge. I'm your host, Lucy May. How is everyone doing today? I hope you're all finding a moment of peace in your busy week. Please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love hearing from our community. If you're ready to see how a good daughter finally sets her boundaries, hit that like button. Today's story is a powerful reminder of our own worth. I'll let Evelyn take it from here. The tires of my SUV crunched over the gravel driveway of the Blue Ridge Lake House, a sound that usually signaled the start of a peaceful weekend. But today, it felt like the ticking of a clock I couldn't stop. I hadn't even managed to pull my keys out of the ignition before the front door creaked open, revealing my father, Arthur, standing there with a glass of single malt scotch already nestled in his hand. The mountain air was crisp, smelling of damp pine and the coming rain, but the atmosphere inside the foyer was suffocatingly heavy. I walked in, the heels of my boots clicking against the polished hardwood, and before I could even offer a greeting or ask about my mother's recovery, a slip of paper was flicked across the heavy oak dining table. It slid with a taunting grace, coming to rest right in front of my handbag as if it had been waiting for its master to arrive. I didn't need to pick it up to know what it was. The bold heading of the county tax assessor was visible from 3 feet away, but the number scrawled in the corner made my stomach do a slow, nauseating turn. $5,000. It was the property tax bill for the vacation home, the very roof over our heads that I had already spent $30,000 renovating just last summer. Arthur didn't look at me with the warmth of a father welcoming his eldest daughter home after a 60-hour work week in the city. Instead, he took a slow, methodical sip of his whiskey, his eyes tracking the amber liquid in the glass with more affection than he had ever shown me. He told me, in a voice as dry as the autumn leaves outside, that I needed to take care of it by Monday morning. When I felt the words, "Why me?" beginning to form in my throat, he cut me off with a wave of his hand, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a physical slap. He explained, with that patronizing tilt of his head he reserved for people he considered beneath him, that Julian was currently in a bit of a financial bind and couldn't be expected to contribute his share this quarter. Apparently, my 28-year-old brother, the golden boy, who still hadn't figured out how to hold a job for more than 6 months, was between opportunities again. Arthur's tone suggested that Julian's lack of funds was a temporary misfortune of the universe, while my ability to pay was simply a law of nature. He didn't ask if I had the money, or if my own mortgage was paid, or if the volatile market had been kind to my trades this week. He simply expected it, the way one expects a vending machine to drop a soda after you punch in the code. I stood there, my coat still draped over my arm, feeling the silence of the room expand until it hummed in my ears. I looked at the $5,000 demand on the oak table, and then back at the man who had raised me to believe that hard work was the only path to respect. Yet here he was, treating my hard work as a communal checking account for his favorite child. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one who had spent my 20s burning the midnight oil, navigating the cutthroat world of stock trading so I could provide a safety net for this family, while Julian spent his days finding himself on my dime. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and remarked that since I was doing so well for myself, $5,000 was practically pocket change. He actually had the audacity to smile, a small, smug curl of the lips, as he suggested that it was my privilege to support the family legacy. It was in that moment, watching the ice cubes clink against the side of his glass, that the numbness in my chest began to crystallize into something much colder and sharper. I realized then that I wasn't a guest in this house, and I certainly wasn't a daughter in his eyes. I was a walking, breathing, automated teller machine with a corner office and a high credit limit. Every holiday, every family emergency, and every unexpected bill over the last 5 years flashed before my eyes like a ledger of my own stupidity. I had funneled over $200,000 into this family, thinking I was buying love and security, only to find out I was just paying the lease on a seat at a table where I wasn't even wanted. My father didn't see my sacrifice. He only saw my utility. He stood up, adjusted his sweater vest, and patted my shoulder with a hand that felt like lead, telling me not to look so glum because Julian was planning a big barbecue for the 4th of July, and it would be good for the soul. He walked toward the kitchen, a tuneless melody, leaving me alone with the ghost of my own resentment. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, and I didn't reach for my checkbook. I simply picked up the tax bill, my fingers steady and my mind suddenly, terrifyingly clear, and stared into the amber depths of the glass he had left on the table. The ATM was about to go out of order, and the fees for the withdrawal were going to be much higher than anyone in this house could ever afford. As the sound of my father's whistling faded into the back of the house, I let my gaze wander to the mantelpiece, where a framed photo of Julian's 16th birthday still sat in a place of honor. I remember that day like it was yesterday, not because of the cake or the celebration, but because of the sharp, cold contrast it drew against the reality I was living. While Julian was being handed the keys to a brand new silver SUV, a vehicle that cost more than my entire first year's tuition, I was standing in the kitchen of a greasy diner 5 miles away, scrubbing dried egg yolk off plates until my knuckles bled. I was 19 then, and I already had 3 jobs. I was a library assistant by morning, a tutor by afternoon, and a waitress by night, all so I could scrape together enough cents to pay for the textbooks my father claimed we could not afford. He told me then that character is built through struggle, a lesson he apparently decided Julian was too delicate to inherit. I believed him back then. I truly, naively believed that if I worked harder, if I became the most successful version of myself, I would finally see that look of pride in his eyes, the one he gave Julian just for simply existing. The memories began to flood back, each one a jagged piece of a mirror showing me a girl who had sacrificed her youth to be the reliable one. I remembered the winter of my sophomore year when the heater in my tiny off-campus apartment broke down. I had spent my last $40 on a used coat because I did not want to ask for help, only to find out later that week that my father had paid for Julian's spring break trip to Cancun because he needed to blow off some steam after failing his midterms. I did not complain. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, just like the American dream I had been raised to worship, believing that self-reliance was the highest form of virtue. I survived on black coffee and 3 hours of sleep, fueled by the desperate hope that my independence would one day be recognized as a gift to the family. Instead, it became my cage. My success did not buy me respect. It only bought me the privilege of becoming the family's unpaid consultant and emergency fund. For 15 years, I have lived with this quiet, simmering resentment tucked neatly under my professional exterior. I remember the first time I made a significant commission as a junior trader. I was 24, and I had stayed up for 48 hours straight to nail a complex series of trades. I called home, my voice trembling with excitement, ready to tell my father that I could finally help them fix the leaking roof on the family home. He didn't ask how I was or if I was eating enough. He simply told me the amount the contractor had quoted and asked if I could wire the funds by Friday so Julian didn't have to listen to the annoying sound of the rain hitting the tarps. That was the first time I felt it. That dull, aching realization that I was not a daughter being celebrated, but a resource being harvested. I was the drought-resistant crop that kept the farm running, while the prize orchid in the greenhouse was pampered and shielded from every breeze. Every time I tried to set a boundary, my father would invoke the family legacy or remind me of how much potential Julian had if he just had a little more time to find his footing. I watched as my brother transitioned from a spoiled teenager into a professional parasite, a man-child who viewed my bank account as his own personal safety net. He never had to worry about inflation or healthcare costs because he knew Evelyn would take care of it. He never had to feel the weight of responsibility that had turned my hair gray at 30 because I was always there to catch him before he hit the ground. I see now that by saving him, my parents were actually burying me. They were using my life force to fuel his laziness, treating my ambition as a communal pool of resources that I had no right to claim for myself. Standing in this house, surrounded by the expensive furniture I had paid for and the peace of mind I had subsidized, the weight of the last 15 years felt like a physical burden on my chest. I looked at my hands, the hands of a woman who had worked since she was 14, who had navigated the shark-infested waters of Wall Street, and who had never once been given a free pass. And then I looked at the tax bill on the table, a $5,000 insult to every hour of overtime I had ever clocked. The golden boy was still shining, but only because I was the one polishing him until my fingers were raw. I realized then that I had never been the prodigal son because I was too busy being the one who kept the lights on so he could find his way home. But the light was about to go out. And for the first time in my life, I was not going to be the one to fix the fuse. I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps heavy with the weight of my father's arrogance, but I tried to steady my breathing by focusing on my mother, Martha. If there was one person in this house who I believed truly understood the meaning of sacrifice, it was her. She was the one who had worked as a school secretary for 30 years, the one who had mended my clothes and whispered encouragement when my father's silence was too loud. At least, that was the story I had told myself to make the checks I wrote every month feel like an act of love rather than a cold transaction. Last month, she had called me, her voice trembling with a vulnerability that made my heart ache, telling me that her knee surgery was going to cost $8,000 out of pocket because of a gap in her insurance coverage. I didn't hesitate. I wired the money within the hour, even though it meant delaying my own vacation. I walked into the kitchen, intending to ask her how she was feeling, but the sight of her bank statement sitting open on the granite island stopped me mid-stride. It was just a piece of paper, a standard monthly summary from the local credit union, but in the afternoon light, the ink looked like a confession. I didn't mean to pry, but my eyes were trained to spot anomalies in data. It was what I did for a living. My gaze fell on the date of May 14th. At 10:15 in the morning, my wire transfer of $8,000 had hit her account. At 12:15, exactly 2 hours later, the entire balance had been swept clean, transferred via a mobile app to a recipient listed simply as Julian Harper. I stood there, the refrigerator humming a low, mocking tune, as the air seemed to vanish from the room. She hadn't even waited for the ink to dry on the deposit before handing it over to him. The knee surgery she had complained about was a lie, a carefully crafted emotional trap designed to milk me of the money she knew Julian would only squander. The betrayal felt different than the one from my father. With Arthur, it was an expected arrogance, a transaction of power. But this was a betrayal of the heart. My mother had used her own perceived physical pain, her own aging body, to manipulate my sense of duty. She knew that I would never say no to her health, and she had exploited that trust to fuel Julian's reckless lifestyle. I felt a cold, sharp realization wash over me. I wasn't just the family's bank. I was being hunted by the very people I thought I was protecting. My mother wasn't a passive victim of my father's favoritism. She was an active participant, the silent architect of my exploitation who used guilt as her primary weapon. Just as I was about to fold the paper and walk away, I heard the back door click open and the sound of laughter drifted in from the patio. It was Julian's voice, loud and boastful, followed by my mother's melodic giggle, a sound she rarely shared with me. I stayed in the shadows of the pantry, an invisible observer in my own family's home, as they walked into the breakfast nook. Julian was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone, bragging about a sure thing bet he had placed on a basketball game over the weekend. My mother reached out and patted his cheek, her face glowing with a pride that made my stomach churn. She called him her smart boy and told him she was glad he had finally caught a break, never mentioning that his break had been funded by the money I had earned through 80-hour work weeks and missed sleep. I watched them, the woman I thought was my anchor, and the brother I thought was just lost. And I realized they were a perfect ecosystem of parasitic behavior. They didn't see me as a person with my own dreams or exhaustion. They saw me as a tap that they could turn on whenever they needed to wash away their own failures. My mother looked at Julian with an adoration that was almost blind, her eyes crinkling as she told him not to worry about the details, because Evelyn would always make sure the family stayed afloat. That was the moment the last thread of my loyalty snapped. The heat of my anger didn't burn. It froze into a solid, unbreakable resolve. I realized that as long as I kept paying the bills, they would never have to face the truth of who they were. I wasn't helping them. I was enabling their rot. I backed out of the kitchen silently, the bank statement still burned into my retinas. They didn't even know I was there, which was fitting, because in their world, I only existed when they needed to sign a check. I went upstairs to my childhood bedroom, a place that no longer felt like home, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were steady as I pulled out my laptop. I was no longer the daughter who was trying to earn her parents' love. I was a professional who had just discovered a massive case of internal fraud in her most important account. It was time to stop being the victim of their story and start being the auditor of their reality. The laughter from downstairs continued, oblivious and entitled. But I knew something they didn't. The audit was beginning, and I was going to account for every single cent. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clinking of silverware against china from downstairs, a sound that served as a summons to a dinner table where I was no longer a daughter, but a silent benefactor. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my expensive wool trousers, and descended the stairs with the measured calm of a trader walking onto a volatile floor. The dining room was filled with the warm, golden glow of the chandelier I had purchased for my mother's 65th birthday, but the atmosphere felt like an icebox. My father was already halfway through a second glass of wine, his face flushed with a self-important glow, while Julian sat next to him, grinning at his phone with the vacant entitlement of a man who had never had to balance a checkbook in his life. My mother hovered near the sideboard, her injured knee miraculously allowing her to carry a heavy roast platter without a single wince. I took my seat in silence, watching them. The irony of the scene tastes like ash in my mouth. The conversation didn't start with a question about my life or my career. It began with a boast from my father about the family's bright future. He cleared his throat, leaning back in the heavy oak chair I had paid to have refinished, and announced that Julian had finally decided to settle down and propose to his latest girlfriend, a girl he had known for less than 4 months. I felt a pang of pity for the girl, but it was quickly eclipsed by the smug look Julian threw across the table at me. Then Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box that made my heart stop. He opened it to reveal the vintage 2-carat Art Deco diamond ring that had belonged to my grandmother, Rose. It was the only piece of jewelry she had ever owned, a symbol of her 50 years of hard work and resilience, and she had sat me on her lap when I was 10 years old and whispered that it was meant for me, because I had her fire. Arthur didn't even look at me as he slid the box toward Julian, remarking that a Harper man needed a proper stone to represent the family's status. He said it was important for the family legacy to stay with the person who would carry on the name, a thinly veiled insult to my own choice to remain independent and focused on my career. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly under the table, feeling the silence of the abyss swallow the last of my childhood illusions. They weren't just taking my money for taxes and surgeries anymore. They were reaching into the past and stripping away the only piece of sentimental value I had ever asked for. Julian picked up the ring, turning it in the light with a casual indifference that made me want to scream, and joked that the diamond looked like it could use a serious upgrade once he got his hands on his trust fund. My mother nodded in agreement, telling him that he deserved the best, while she studiously avoided looking at the daughter who had just paid for her fake medical bills. The realization hit me with the force of a market crash. They didn't just want my financial support. They wanted to erase my worth entirely. To them, I was a utility, a nameless engine that generated the capital required to keep their delusions of grandeur alive. My father looked at me then, his eyes cold and patronizing, and asked why I wasn't smiling, suggesting that I was jealous of my brother's happiness. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I didn't let a single tear fall. Instead, I let my professional instincts take over. the part of me that analyzed high-risk assets and moved to liquidate before the loss became catastrophic. I realized that I had been long on this family for 30 years, and the returns were not just zero, they were negative. I looked at Julian, who was now pretending to propose to a salt shaker with my grandmother's ring, and then at my parents, who were at his antics as if he were a performing seal. The deep, aching pain that had lived in my chest for 15 years suddenly went numb, replaced by the razor-sharp clarity of a strategist. I was no longer a sister or a daughter in this room. I was a predator who had just identified her prey. They wanted to treat me like an ATM? Fine. But they had forgotten that every withdrawal comes with a record, and I was about to audit them into bankruptcy. As the dinner continued, I began to mentally draft the spreadsheet of their downfall, calculating the interest on every cent of the $200,000 I had wasted on their ungrateful lives. I decided right then that I would not cry another tear for people who valued a name over a person. I pushed my chair back, the wood scraping against the floor like a declaration of war, and stood up. I looked at my father, who was still wearing that smug, self-satisfied grin, and I didn't see a patriarch anymore. I saw a bad investment that I was about to cut loose. The next morning, the lake was shrouded in a thick, gray mist that clung to the water like a secret, a fitting reflection of the cold clarity that had settled in my bones. I was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee that tasted like burnt resolution, when my father called out to me from his study. His voice was thick with the remnants of last night's scotch, but it still carried that edge of command he used when he needed something done that required more than 2 brain cells. He was looking for the property deed for the back lot because the neighbor was complaining about a fence line, and in his hungover state, he had managed to turn his mahogany desk into a graveyard of disorganized folders. I walked in, my expression a mask of dutiful compliance, the invisible observer he had trained me to be. He grumbled about his failing eyesight and waved me toward the small floor safe tucked behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines, telling me the deed was in a blue manila folder. I knelt on the rug, my fingers steady as I punched in the code, my mother's birthday, a sequence of numbers used to guard the very lies that were destroying me. I found the blue folder quickly enough, but as I moved to close the heavy steel door, my eyes caught a glimpse of a different document, one bound in formal legal vellum with the seal of a prominent law firm in the city. It wasn't the deed. It was a trust agreement, dated 3 years ago, with the name Julian Harper embossed in gold lettering across the cover. My heart didn't race. It slowed down, each beat measured and cold, as I flipped open the first page. There it was, laid out in black and white, a $350,000 irrevocable trust fund established by Arthur Harper for the sole benefit of his son. The document outlined a schedule of disbursements designed to ensure Julian's long-term financial security and lifestyle maintenance. While I had been working 80-hour weeks to cover $5,000 tax bills and $8,000 surgeries, my father had been sitting on a small fortune, carefully shielding it from the very family needs he claimed were my privilege to pay for. The realization hit me with a chilling, intellectual satisfaction that surpassed any emotional pain. This wasn't just favoritism. It was a calculated, multi-year financial fraud perpetrated by my own parents. They had deliberately drained over $200,000 of my hard-earned capital over the last 5 years, treating me like an interest-free loan that they never intended to repay, all while maintaining a $350,000 safety net for a man who couldn't even manage to wake up before noon. I felt the su im lang qua vuxo, the silence of the deep, settling over me. I didn't gasp or cry out. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket and began to flip through the pages, my thumb steady as I captured high-resolution images of every clause, every signature, and every bank account number listed in the annex. I was no longer a daughter looking for a deed. I was a forensic analyst documenting a crime scene. As I finished photographing the final page, I heard my father's heavy footsteps approaching the door. With the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years zhang yu, playing the fool to keep the peace, I slid the trust document back into its hiding place and held up the blue deed folder just as he entered the room. He took the deed from me without a word of thanks, complaining instead about how long it had taken me to find it. I watched him, seeing the smallness of the man behind the roar of his arrogance. He thought he was the master strategist, the patriarch protecting his legacy. But he had forgotten one fundamental rule of the market. Never underestimate the person who manages your risk. I walked out of the study, the digital evidence of their betrayal tucked safely in my pocket, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in decades. The ATM hadn't just gone out of order. It had just completed its final audit, and the findings were catastrophic for the Harper estate. I left the Blue Ridge Lake House that afternoon without saying goodbye, the digital images of the trust fund documents burning a hole in my memory. I drove straight back to the city, the skyscrapers rising up to meet me like the familiar walls of a fortress where logic still reigned supreme. 2 days later, I sat in a sleek, glass-walled office in Midtown, facing Silas Vance. Silas wasn't just an accountant. He was a hunter of hidden assets, a man who spoke the language of ledgers and offshore accounts with the fluency of a native. He was 60 years old, with eyes as sharp as a scalpel, and a demeanor that suggested he had seen every dirty trick the human heart could devise. I laid out my folders, the ones I had been meticulously curating for 5 years. My mother had always laughed at my obsessive record-keeping, calling it a personality quirk. But as I spread the digital printouts and scanned receipts across the mahogany table, Silas saw it for what it truly was, a preemptive strike. We began the grim task of quantification, a process that felt more like an autopsy than an audit. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the systematic extraction of my life's work. We started with the emergency medical bills for my mother's knees, $8,000 that had vanished into Julian's betting apps in less than 2 hours. Then came the property taxes for the lake house, totaling $25,000 over the last 3 years. We added the bridge loans for Julian's failed startups, the car insurance premiums I had paid for a brother who couldn't keep a clean driving record, and the monthly stipends I had sent to my parents to ensure they could live in the style they felt they deserved. Silas's fingers flew across his keyboard, the tapping sound like the drumbeat of a coming war. The final number that flashed on his screen was $118,745. That was the price of my loyalty. That was the exact amount they had siphoned from my future to fuel their collective delusion. Silas leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the heavy silence of the office. He looked at the total, then back at me, his expression unreadable. I didn't feel the need to explain my pain or justify my anger. I spoke to him in the language we both understood, the language of return on investment and risk management. I told him that I considered this family a toxic asset, a venture that had failed to yield any moral or emotional dividends. I told him I wanted every cent documented, every transfer traced, and every lie cross-referenced with the $350,000 trust fund I had discovered in my father's safe. I wanted a forensic report so airtight that not even the best family lawyer in the state could find a crack in it. My mind was focused with an intensity I usually reserved for high-frequency trading sessions. I was no longer a daughter. I was a liquidator. There was a strange, cold comfort in the numbers. They were objective. They didn't care about family legacy or who the golden boy was. They only told the truth of where the value had gone and who had stolen it. Silas started to assemble the pieces, linking the $8,000 from the surgery directly to Julian's account, then showing how my father had shifted his own personal funds into the trust while using my checks to pay the household staff. It was a beautiful, terrible tapestry of manipulation. I watched as my life's history was transformed into a weapon, a stack of receipts that would soon dismantle the very foundation of the Harper household. Silas looked up from his monitor, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He remarked that most people in my position would be in a therapist's office, weeping over the betrayal. But here I was, providing him with a level of documentation that was almost professional. He closed the file with a decisive snap, his eyes locking onto mine with a newfound respect. He whispered that I had clearly been preparing for this day for a very long time, and I realized he was right. I hadn't just been saving receipts. I had been building a gallows. The ATM was officially out of service. I spent Monday morning in my office, not looking at ticker symbols or market fluctuations, but logging into the various portals that connected my hard-earned capital to the Harper family's comfort. It was a digital slash-and-burn mission. With a few precise clicks, I disconnected Julian's unlimited data plan, the one he used to stream sports bets while he was supposed to be job hunting. Next, I canceled the autopay for the premium insurance on the silver SUV that had been my grandmother's legacy and his personal playground. Finally, I cut the cord on the $600 a month concierge medical service I had set up for my parents, the one they used for preventative massages and fake knee consultations. As each subscription canceled notification popped up on my screen, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the reclamation of my own boundaries. It didn't take long for the silence to break. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone began to vibrate with a frantic energy. First came the text from Julian, a chaotic string of acronyms and exclamation points demanding to know why his 5G connection had been severed in the middle of a crucial game. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted from confusion to an ugly, familiar entitlement. He called me selfish. He said I was losing my mind and that I owed him an explanation for disrupting his life. I watched the messages pile up on my lock screen, each one a testament to the monster I had helped create. Instead of feeling guilty, I felt a strange, detached curiosity. I was no longer the sister who needed to fix his problems. I was the observer recording his reaction to the first real consequence of his life. Every insulting text he sent was a new line item in the file Silas was building, proof of the toxic environment I was finally exiting. Then came the heavy artillery, my father. Arthur didn't text. He called with the booming authority of a man who expected the world to stop turning when he spoke. I let it go to voicemail twice before finally picking up, adopting the silence of the deep that had become my new armor. He didn't ask how I was. He went straight for the throat, his voice trembling with a calculated rage. He told me that my mother was in tears because she couldn't call her sister on the family plan, and that I was disgracing the Harper name by being so petty over a few bills. He used the word ungrateful 6 times in 3 minutes. I sat there in my quiet apartment, looking out at the city skyline, and didn't interrupt him once. I let his anger hit the wall of my indifference and slide right off. When he finally paused for breath, expecting me to apologize or offer a check, I simply said, "The account has been audited, Father. The credit line is closed." The silence that followed on his end was more satisfying than any argument I could have won. The most intoxicating part of it all was the realization that I didn't need their approval to be whole. For years, I had been paying a love tax, a massive financial and emotional levy that I hoped would buy me a seat at their table. Now, I was enjoying the peace that came with being an outcast. I spent my evening at a quiet bistro, reading a book and sipping a glass of wine that I had paid for with money that didn't have a Harper family string attached to it. Julian's final text of the night arrived just as I was paying my tab. It was a rambling 3-paragraph manifesto on how I was ruining his future because he couldn't get to a job interview without the gas card I had just deactivated. I looked at the message, thinking of the SUV he had been given while I scrubbed plates at 19, and I felt a small, sharp smile touch my lips. I typed out a single, cold response. "It sounds like you have a lot to think about on the walk to the station. You should learn how to take the bus, Julian. It builds character, and it's excellent for your credit score." I hit send and turned my phone off, the silence of the night finally belonging to me. Hi, everyone. It's Lucy May. Seeing Evelyn stand her ground gives me chills. It's so hard to say no to family, isn't it? Have any of you ever had to stop being the fixer for everyone else's mistakes? I'd love to read your experiences in the comments. And if you're proud of Evelyn for finally choosing herself, please give this video a like. Let's get back to the final showdown at the lake house. The silence that followed my text about the bus was the loudest sound I had heard in years. It lasted exactly 48 hours before the next move in this chess game was made. It didn't come as a shout or a flurry of insults, but as a cold, formal invitation sent via a group text that included my Uncle Benjamin and Aunt Margaret. My father, Arthur, was a master of the public ambush, a man who believed that if he gathered enough witnesses, I would be forced to fold under the weight of family tradition and collective guilt. The message was simple. Family meeting at the lake house, Friday at 7. We need to discuss the future of the Harper estate and the recent misunderstandings. Ben and Margaret will be there to help us find a path forward. I knew exactly what that meant. In the Harper family vocabulary, discussing the future was code for, "Evelyn, open your wallet." And mediators, like Uncle Benjamin, were really just there to act as the jury for my supposed crimes against blood and loyalty. Uncle Benjamin was the older brother, a man who had built a successful construction firm on the back of the same work hard, play fair American dream that I had tried to live by. He was the kind of man who believed in the sanctity of the family name above all else, often ignoring the rot inside the house as long as the exterior paint was fresh. Aunt Margaret was his counterpart, the keeper of social graces who believed that a well-timed casserole and a stern look could fix a fractured soul. By bringing them in, Arthur was attempting to put me on trial in the court of family opinion, hoping the elders would shame me back into my role as the silent benefactor. They were the guardians of a world that was rapidly disappearing, one where daughters were expected to be the glue that held together the broken pieces of their brothers' lives, without ever asking why the brothers weren't carrying their own weight. I spent the days leading up to Friday, not in tears, but in preparation. This was the ASMR for the brain phase, where my professional expertise as a trader merged with my newfound resolve. I worked with Silas Vance to finalize the Harper Liability Report, a 30-page document that detailed every cent siphoned from my accounts over the last 5 years. I had it bound in a sleek professional folder that looked more like a corporate merger proposal than a family grievance. This was the diction of expertise. I wasn't going to argue like a hurt child. I was going to present like a CEO announcing a massive divestment. I practiced my silence of the deep, rehearsing the way I would look at them when they threw their accusations of selfishness at me. I was the invisible observer no longer. I was the auditor who had arrived to collect a debt that was long overdue. On Friday afternoon, I didn't reach for the soft sweaters or the casual jeans I usually wore to the lake house. Instead, I put on my armor, a sharp navy pinstripe power suit that I usually reserved for high-stakes board meetings in the city. I paired it with a crisp white blouse and a pair of heels that sounded like a gavel striking a floor with every step I took. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't see the daughter who was desperate for a pat on the head. I saw a woman who was about to dismantle a decades-long system of manipulation. I was calm, my heart rate steady, my mind a cold map of data points and legal precedents. I was the personification of the self-made woman they always claimed to admire. Yet I knew that tonight, that very independence would be framed as a betrayal. The drive to Blue Ridge Lake was peaceful. The mountain air was turning cold, and the trees were beginning to shed their leaves, preparing for the winter, a season of reckoning. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, I saw the silver SUV I was no longer paying for parked crookedly in the grass, a symbol of Julian's permanent state of disarray. The lights in the living room were all on, casting long, sharp shadows against the trees. I could see the silhouettes of 4 people through the window sitting in the heavy furniture I had financed, probably drinking the whiskey I had bought. I took a moment in the car to check my phone one last time, a final confirmation from Silas that the legal papers were ready to be filed if tonight didn't go as planned. I stepped out of the car, the mountain wind biting at my face, but I didn't shiver. I walked up the porch steps, the sound of my heels echoing in the quiet night like a warning. I didn't knock. I still had my key, though I knew it would be the last time I would ever use it. When I pushed the door open, the conversation in the living room died instantly. The smell of wood smoke and expensive tobacco filled the air, a scent that used to mean home, but now just meant the scene of the crime. My father was in his usual chair. Uncle Benjamin was standing by the fireplace with a look of practiced disappointment, and Aunt Margaret was patting my mother's hand as she pretended to wipe away a tear. Julian was slumped on the sofa, looking like a teenager who had been caught skipping school, rather than a man nearing 30. I stood in the doorway for a long second, letting the silence of the deep fill the room, my blue pinstripe suit a stark, professional contrast to their cozy domestic facade. I didn't offer a greeting, and I didn't apologize for being late. I simply walked to the center of the room and placed my professional folder on the coffee table with a soft, final thud. The trial was about to begin, and I was the only one in the room who knew that I wasn't the defendant. I was the judge. The heavy silence in the room was exactly what I had expected, a thick, suffocating blanket of judgment that my father had carefully woven before I even arrived. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound like a gavel in the quiet of the mountain house, and leaned forward with a look of practiced disappointment that would have broken me a year ago. He began by telling the room how disturbed he was by my recent behavior, calling my decision to cut off the family's essential services an act of unstable cruelty that no Harper daughter should ever commit. He looked at Uncle Benjamin and Aunt Margaret, seeking their silent affirmation as he demanded an immediate apology and the restoration of the accounts, claiming I was confused by the pressures of my job. I let him speak until his face turned a shade of crimson that matched his scotch, and then I did something he didn't expect. I didn't cry, I didn't defend my character, and I certainly didn't apologize. Instead, I opened the professional folder and began to slide the forensic reports across the coffee table, one by one, like cards in a high-stakes game where I already knew everyone's hand. I spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of every hour of overtime I had ever worked, a silence of the deep that commanded the room's attention. I told them that we were not here to discuss my emotions, but to perform a long overdue audit of the Harper family's ethics. I started with the document labeled Summary of Extraction, which detailed the $118,745 I had funneled into this house over the last 5 years. Money they had taken while telling me I was the family's only hope for survival. I watched Aunt Margaret's eyes widen as she scanned the line items for emergency repairs and medical bills that she knew had never happened. Then I turned my gaze to my mother, who was shrinking into the upholstery, and I laid out the bank records showing the $8,000 I had sent for her knee surgery being transferred to Julian's gambling account within 2 hours. The room went from a trial of my selfishness to a gallery of their betrayal. And for the first time in 30 years, the golden boy Julian looked like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. But the killing blow was the vellum-bound document I saved for last. I slid the high-resolution photos of the $350,000 trust fund toward Uncle Benjamin, the man who had always been told by my father that the family was on the brink of financial ruin. I explained, with the cold diction of expertise of a woman who liquidated assets for a living, that while my father was begging me for tax money and my mother was faking illnesses to fund Julian's vices, they were sitting on a secret fortune dedicated solely to the man who had never earned a cent in his life. I watched the color drain from my father's face as his brother Benjamin stood up with a look of pure, unadulterated kin-be. The manipulation that had held this family together for decades didn't just crack. It shattered into a million jagged pieces. I felt a profound sense of catharsis, a release so powerful it felt like I was breathing real air for the first time since I was a child. The ATM was not just out of order. It had just foreclosed on their entire reality. My father tried to sputter a defense, claiming he was just protecting the legacy, but I cut him off with a single, sharp look that silenced him more effectively than any shout ever could. I told them that I was done being the privilege they exploited, and that every penny documented in that folder was now a formal debt I expected to be addressed. I looked at my mother, whose fake tears had finally turned real, and felt nothing but a distant, professional pity. I wasn't the unstable one anymore. I was the only person in the room with a clear balance sheet. Uncle Benjamin turned to my father, his voice trembling with a quiet, dangerous rage as he asked how Arthur could have done this to his own daughter, especially while taking loans from the rest of the family for Julian as well. The golden boy was now just a tarnished statue, and the patriarch was just a man caught in a web of his own making. I sat back in the heavy chair I had paid for, feeling the weight of the Harper name finally lifting off my heart, replaced by the solid, unshakable power of the truth. The air in the room didn't just feel cold, it felt thin, as if the lies that had filled it for 30 years had finally been sucked out, leaving only the hard, unyielding truth of the ledger. Uncle Benjamin's voice broke the silence, heavy with a disgust that Arthur couldn't manipulate away, asking how he could have used his own daughter as a predatory lender for a trust fund she didn't even know existed. I didn't wait for my father to find his voice. I was no longer interested in his explanations, his excuses, or his hollow legacy talk. I pulled a set of legal transfer documents from my folder, papers Silas Vance and I had prepared with the cold, surgical precision of a hostile takeover, and laid them on the table next to the whiskey glass that now seemed so pathetic. I told him, in a voice that was as calm as a closing bell on the trading floor, that the $118,745 they had siphoned from my life was no longer a gift of love, but a documented, non-negotiable liability. I gave him a choice that was really no choice at all, a showdown that left him with zero leverage. He could sign over 50% of the title to this lake house to me immediately to settle the debt, or I would file a formal suit against Julian for the misappropriation of the $8,000 meant for a fake surgery. The threat wasn't a bluff. It was a liquidation strategy intended to achieve intellectual satisfaction by turning their own greed against them. My father looked at me, and for the first time in my life, the mask of the powerful patriarch crumbled, revealing a small, terrified man who had gambled his daughter's soul to protect his son's laziness. His face went from a flush of Niaomang to a pale Huangmang gray, and finally to a look of defeated fear. He tried to argue that the house was his legacy, his piece of the American dream, but I whispered the truth so quietly it felt like a scream. I reminded him that he had sold that legacy the moment he lied to me about my mother's health and used my self-reliance as a weapon against me. I told him that a house built on fraud wasn't a home. It was just a collection of bad debt, and I was here to collect. Julian started to say something about how unfair this was, his voice cracking with the realization that the ATM was now his landlord. But I didn't even look at him. I turned my attention to the velvet box sitting on the sideboard, the one containing Grandmother Rose's 2-carat diamond ring. I walked over and picked it up, feeling the cool, honest weight of the stone, the only thing in this room that hadn't been bought with a lie. I told Julian that a man who couldn't even pay his own phone bill didn't deserve a stone that represented 50 years of hard work, and I slipped the ring onto my own finger, where it had always belonged. The satisfaction wasn't about the jewelry. It was about the reclamation of a memory they had tried to turn into a bribe. Arthur's hand was shaking, the age spots on his skin standing out like ink on parchment, as he reached for the pen Aunt Margaret handed him with a look of silent, freezing condemnation. He signed the transfer deed, his signature a jagged, ugly scrawl that signaled the end of his reign and the aftermath of his selfishness. I watched the ink dry, feeling a profound sense of catharsis that surpassed any anger I had ever felt. This was the price of fairness, a calculated resolution that ensured the inheritance was finally going to the person who actually knew the value of $1. I felt a lightness in my chest, a rebirth of the woman who had spent 15 years playing 2 roles, the dutiful daughter by day and the strategist by night, trying to buy her way into a family that had only ever seen her as a resource to be harvested. The trap had been sprung, and the twist was that I didn't need their love to be whole. I only needed my own agency. As I gathered my files, the heavy folders snapping shut with a finality that echoed through the room, I looked at my father and my brother one last time. They looked small, diminished, and utterly ordinary. They were no longer the giants who controlled my worth or the gatekeepers of my happiness. They were just 2 people who had failed to realize that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has finally stopped caring about being liked by people who don't respect her. My mother remained huddled on the sofa, her healing language now replaced by the silence of a woman who knew she had lost her most loyal protector. I checked the time on my watch, a piece of equipment I had earned with my own labor, and realized that for the first time in 5 years, my investment was finally back in the black. The social consequences for Julian were just beginning, as Uncle Benjamin was already talking about how the family trust would be audited by an independent firm, ensuring that the $350,000 would no longer be a secret playground for a parasite. I walked toward the door, the sound of my heels on the hardwood a steady, rhythmic pulse of victory, leaving behind the wreckage of a house that was no longer a home, but was finally, legally, half mine. 6 months have passed since the gavel of truth struck the oak table at Blue Ridge Lake, and today, the mountain air feels lighter, as if the very atmosphere has been scrubbed clean of the decades of deception that once hung over this water. I am standing on the expansive cedar deck of the lake house, a deck I now legally own 50% of, watching the early morning mist dance across the surface of the lake like a ghost of the past finally finding its rest. There is a profound silence here now, but it is no longer the silence of the deep I used to wear as armor. It is a restorative, healing quiet that belongs entirely to me. I have replaced the heavy, scotch-stained curtains with linen that breathes, and I have filled the rooms with the scent of fresh eucalyptus and lavender instead of old tobacco and resentment. My father and Julian are no longer the architects of my schedule or the curators of my bank account, and for the first time in my 30 years of life, My heartbeat isn't a frantic tally of how much I owe people who never intended to love me back. The aftermath of the Harper audit was swift and cold, exactly as a market correction should be. And while the social consequences for my father and brother were severe, they were entirely of their own making. Julian was forced to liquidate a significant portion of that secret $350,000 trust fund just to settle the back taxes and the mounting debts I refused to carry anymore. A lesson in accountability that was 30 years overdue. My father is living on a fixed income now, no longer the swaggering patriarch of a hollow empire, but a man who must finally account for his own choices. I occasionally hear from my mother, and while her voice still carries a hint of that old, practiced frailty, I no longer feel the urge to reach for my checkbook to fix her life. I have moved from being the family's invisible observer and unpaid consultant to being a woman who understands that her value is not defined by her utility to others. I look at Grandmother Rose's ring on my finger, the diamond catching the first golden rays of the sun, and I feel a deep sense of peace, knowing that this legacy is finally in the hands of the one who truly understands the cost of character. I have spent these last 6 months learning the language of self-forgiveness, a healing language that focuses on the I instead of the them. I have forgiven that 19-year-old girl who scrubbed plates in a greasy diner while her brother played with the silver SUV. And I have forgiven the woman I became, the one who was so desperate for a seat at the table that she allowed herself to be treated like a communal checking account. I realize now that my self-reliance was never the betrayal my father claimed it was. It was my salvation. The very thing that allowed me to survive the shark-infested waters of my own home. I am no longer an ATM out of order. I am a woman who has closed the branch entirely to bad investments and opened a new account where the only currency is mutual respect and genuine dignity. I have reclaimed my time, my capital, and most importantly, my identity as a self-made woman who no longer needs a patriarch's nod to know she is successful. As the sun climbs higher over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold, I take a final, deep breath of the pine-scented air and realize that my American dream has finally come true, though not in the way I originally imagined. It wasn't about the $200,000 I spent or the 50% of the house I gained. It was about the freedom to walk away from a toxic legacy and drive toward a future of my own design. I pick up my keys, the metal cool and solid in my hand, and walk toward my car without looking back at the house that was once my prison. I am driving toward the sunrise, leaving the wreckage of the Harper lies in the rearview mirror, finally ready to start a chapter where I am the author, the auditor, and the sole beneficiary of my own life. The road ahead is open, the tank is full, and for the first time, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Evelyn's story is a profound lesson for all of us. It's not about the money, really. It's about the moment a woman realizes her love shouldn't be a blank check for others to exploit. Seeing her reclaim her grandmother's ring and her own dignity moved me deeply. To my dear listeners, remember, being a good daughter or a good woman doesn't mean being a martyr. You have every right to protect your hard-earned success and set boundaries, even with family. Your value is inherent, not something you have to buy with every paycheck. How did you feel when Evelyn revealed the trust fund? Did it remind you of a time you had to stand up for yourself? Please share your thoughts and lessons in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for being part of Rose Revenge. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys of strength. Stay strong and take care of yourselves.